What happens when a trade war erupts between two of the world's largest economies? That's the question at the heart of the current conflict between the United States and France. It all started when Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum imports into the United States. These tariffs, a bold move by the U.S., were set at 25%, aimed at boosting American industry and curbing foreign competition. But the fallout was far from what Trump expected. In 2025, France defied all expectations and struck back, creating a brutal 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. This led to a clash that would send shockwaves through global trade, testing alliances and reshaping industries. For decades, the U.S. had been a dominant force in global trade, using tariffs and sanctions to impose economic pressure on other nations. Washington had assumed Europe would comply with its tariffs without much resistance. But France, under President Emmanuel Macron, had other plans. The French government, led by Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, wasted no time in responding. His message was clear: France would not absorb the financial hit, and Europe would not stand idly by. If the U.S. wanted a trade war, Europe would not hesitate to fight back. The first battleground was the auto industry. Steel and aluminum are key components in car manufacturing, and the sudden increase in costs sent shockwaves through European automakers. Renault, Peugeot, and Citroën, major players in the French automotive sector, found themselves facing a difficult decision: either absorb the increased costs or pass them on to consumers. Neither option was viable. Across the border, German automakers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz were in the same predicament. The increase in raw material prices was not just an inconvenience. It was a crisis that threatened to shake the foundations of Europe's automotive industry. The ripple effects were widespread. The car industry, long a symbol of European innovation, found itself in a bind. The surge in production costs eroded profit margins, leaving European manufacturers struggling to maintain profitability. But this wasn't just about financial strain. The entire structure of the global car industry, which had been finely tuned over decades, was now being disrupted. Production schedules, once meticulously planned, were thrown into chaos as raw materials became more expensive and harder to source. This disruption in supply chains, once smooth and efficient, was now riddled with complications. As the crisis deepened, some automakers considered pulling out of the U.S. market altogether rather than deal with the high costs of doing business there. The timing could not have been worse. The global auto industry was already facing significant challenges: rising production costs, the shift to electric vehicles, and a semiconductor shortage. Adding a trade war into the mix seemed like the last thing the industry needed. But for France, this was never just about steel and aluminum. The real fight was about something much bigger: economic sovereignty. France understood that Europe, as an economic superpower, could not allow the U.S. to dictate trade terms without resistance. Macron saw this moment as an opportunity to strengthen the European Union's collective economic power. He called for a coordinated response across Europe, urging unity in the face of U.S. aggression. Within days, talks about retaliatory tariffs on American goods were underway. The EU was no longer just reacting, it was strategizing. But the situation didn't stop there. While the U.S. debated its next move, France made one of its own. In April 2023, President Macron made a strategic visit to Beijing, where French-Chinese trade reached a record $8.9 billion. Macron's visit wasn't just ceremonial. It was a calculated move to secure the future of French manufacturing. The primary focus of this visit was the future of electric vehicles, an area where China has dominated, particularly in battery production. France knew that if it wanted to stay competitive in the next era of auto manufacturing, it needed access to China's expertise in this field. Automakers like Renault and Peugeot quickly saw the writing on the wall and sought partnerships with Chinese firms to secure their supply chains for the future. This, however, was an unintended consequence of the U.S. tariffs. Rather than strengthening U.S. industry, the tariffs had pushed France, a key U.S. ally, closer to China, America's biggest economic rival. It was a move that Washington had never anticipated. For years, the U.S. had assumed that it could impose economic pressure without facing serious retaliation. It believed that any protest from its allies, like France, would be short-lived and easily dismissed. But France's actions had rewritten that assumption. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a shift in the balance of global power. France, through strategic moves, had shown that economic power could be wielded in ways other than through military force or diplomatic maneuvering. And for the first time in a long time, the U.S. was no longer the one dictating the terms. The situation was now at a critical juncture. Airbus, the European aerospace giant, issued a stark warning. If the trade barriers remained in place, Airbus might have to reconsider its focus on U.S. customers. This wasn't just a passing remark. It was a direct challenge to the U.S. industry, signaling that Europe's economic strength could no longer be ignored. The repercussions of these tariffs were rippling out of the automotive sector and into other industries, sparking concerns across the entire global economy. European automakers now faced a difficult decision. With raw material costs surging, they had three options: absorb the increased financial burden, relocate production to regions with fewer restrictions, or find alternative suppliers in Asia and South America. Each of these options came with significant risks and consequences, and none of them were simple. The stakes for European manufacturers had never been higher. At the same time, rising vehicle prices began to concern consumers. If prices for cars continued to climb due to the tariffs, many buyers would hold off on making purchases, waiting for prices to stabilize or opting for cheaper alternatives. This slowdown in sales would not only affect corporate profits, but also trigger job losses, factory closures, and a painful restructuring of global supply chains. The automobile industry, already facing significant disruptions, was now on the brink of a full-blown crisis. But the implications of the tariffs went beyond just the auto industry or even Europe. This was a direct challenge to the balance of international trade. Brussels quickly realized the gravity of the situation and moved swiftly to retaliate. Macron had made it clear that Europe would not tolerate the U.S. imposing unilateral tariffs without facing consequences. Soon, discussions of retaliatory tariffs on American goods were in motion. The diplomatic door remained open, but the message was clear. If Washington kept pushing, Europe would push back. The prospect of a full-scale trade war between the world's two largest economies loomed large. If the U.S. and Europe went head-to-head in a tariff battle, the results could be disastrous. Markets would shake, supply chains would fracture, and investors, already wary of economic instability, would pull back. The tariffs could spiral into a prolonged standoff, with no clear winners, only economic damage. This wasn't just about steel, aluminum, or even cars anymore. The very foundation of international trade and trust was at stake. For American automakers like Ford and General Motors, the stakes were enormous. European tariffs on U.S. exports could devastate sales of high-end models and electric vehicles, sectors they were betting heavily on. Meanwhile, European manufacturers faced their own nightmare scenario: potential U.S. import restrictions that could cut them off from one of their most profitable markets. The global automotive industry was on the edge, and the outcome of this trade conflict would determine its future. As tensions mounted, pressure on policymakers intensified. Industry leaders were no longer willing to wait for governments to resolve the situation. Automakers, suppliers, and consumers all stood at the precipice, unsure of what the future held. The question now wasn't just about trade, it was about global economic stability. Would the U.S. and Europe find a way to defuse the crisis? Or was this the beginning of a new era of economic rivalry? Only time would tell.